In today's video, I'm giving you a simple framework for making more interesting combat. Greetings gamers, I'm Anto and welcome to Kraken Week.
The Kraken!
This is a special event put on by a whole bunch of RPG tubers to come together and talk about a bunch of nautical themed topics and videos and kind of celebrate each other in the RPG tuber space. For my contribution, I wanted to talk about a recent session that I ran that had some ocean-born combat and isn't really specific to ocean themed. It just happens to take place on the ocean, but you can apply this to a multitude of different combat scenarios to make your encounters more fun. So for a little setup, my players were on a ship bound for the unclaimed lands. They were going there to do a big old quest and get a big old payday. They'd been traveling for more than a week already, and for most of that journey I'd kept it pretty short and sweet. I'd just given them a summary of that day's weather and then given the opportunity to do any role playing they wanted to do, pointed out any landmarks that they saw as they were sailing around the island of Or towards the Cut, which is the large channel that separates mainland Talavar from the island of Or and would be the site of our combat. Now, for my weather, I use this excellent hex chart that I found on the OSR subreddit, and I'll leave a link in the description for that. And I do this on pretty much every adventuring day. I tell the players what the weather is. I do this for a couple of reasons. One, it helps ground them in the world, but two, it means when I want to introduce weather effects that are going to be tied to elements of the story or tied to elements of an encounter, they don't immediately scream as being a red flag of, oh, this is something the GM is highlighting, therefore it has relevance, because I highlight it every session. So as the players are sailing across the Cut, I describe this front of fog and mist that moves in and encompasses the ship, and they lose all visibility. The captain of the ship starts getting really anxious and paranoid and talking about how ships have disappeared in these mists, and after a bit of discussion the players decide, right, let's change course, get ourselves out of this mist. It might add a couple days to our journey, but that's fine, let's get out of these mists. And as they emerge from them, they find they are surrounded by pirate boarding craft. Now, being attacked on the water by pirates or the Kraken or basically anything else is pretty cliche when it comes to D&D style encounters, but it's one of those cliches that I think the players would honestly be a bit disappointed if they went an entire seaborne journey and nothing happened. So I'm completely fine with deploying these things. The only reason I didn't use a Kraken in this situation is because I have deployed a Kraken on them in the past and I don't want to retread the same ground with the same people. So we come to the encounter and my main tip for this video, and that is when you're building encounters, make sure there are objectives within the encounter beyond just fight for your life. It sounds really simple, but I'm going to show you with the example of this combat encounter how effective it can be. Now, I knew my players had had a long rest and this would likely be their only encounter in the day, so they'd have all their spells or their abilities. They'd have the option to go Nova on this encounter, and if I used it as a normal medium encounter, they would have steamrolled it. So I needed to think a little bit differently, and the way I approached this was actually I made it multiple encounters kind of on top of each other and immediately following each other. So the way I broke this down was into 3 different stages. Stage 1 is the initial assault. Stage 2 I called reinforcements arrive, the Mast in danger. And stage 3 is don't ignore the wizard, anchors away. And I'll go through each of these stages and talk about the way that I deployed enemies and the way that I ratcheted up the tension so that you can apply these things to your own games. So in stage 1 is the initial assault, and the purpose of this to set the stage, to introduce a lot of the combatants, to get the players familiar with the environment that they're going to be fighting in, and to start laying the groundwork for some of the complications. So my players were on a ship and they're out in the middle of the ocean. That gives us a pretty defined boundary for their combat to take place in. And it also means we've got multiple points where we can introduce non-combat based encounter hazards, if you like. So I knew that I wanted to target the masts, because if the masts of a ship go down, it's dead in the water. I knew that I wanted to introduce elements of fire because a wooden ship catching fire is really dangerous. I knew I wanted to interact with the anchors in some way because that's a great way to slow the ship down. And I also knew I wanted to have people get thrown overboard if possible because that's another great dynamic option in the combat. But this initial assault was just about setting the stage. So The first thing that I did was a bit of description. I described all of these pirates swarming onto the ship and the crew, the non-player character crew of the ship, swarming to fight them. And rather than tracking a couple dozen extra NPCs in the combat, I said, right, this whole area of the midship counts as difficult terrain because there is a swirling melee happening here, and you have to pick your way through all of the enemies and allies fighting each other if you want to get through the midship. The players were completely fine with this. I think that's a really simple and elegant way to handle a mass combat, is just go, there's a load of people fighting here, it's difficult terrain, and then keep describing elements of that fight at the top of each round to talk about how that fight looks to be going, and the players might use some of their abilities to interact with it if they want, but if they want to ignore it, that's fine. It's just set dressing, a backdrop, and a little bit of difficult terrain to impact the flow of battle. Then I had multiple small ships carrying enemies approach the large vessel that the players were on. Several of them managed to make it to the vessel. I had maybe half a dozen enemies make it onto the midship. Some of them make it onto the back of the ship where the players and their kind of principal NPCs were, and then a big ship full of enemies off to the side. All of these enemies were incredibly low level, much lower level than the players needed to encounter, and they were all very bunched up. The whole purpose of this is to start getting casters to burn some of their AoE spells. It's my experience that if you put a big group of people in front of a wizard, that wizard will cast Fireball. And exactly as I thought, the wizard cast Fireball on the boat filled with pirates that was coming towards them. Absolutely slaughtered them because they were so low level, but that was fine because the purpose of this first stage is resource depletion. One of the big problems when it comes to running a combat like this is your players are kind of topped up. They've got everything in the bank. So by deploying some really low-level enemies, I can use lots of them that aren't realistically going to do much, if any, damage to the players. At least not at first. It will start to change once they start to get into flanking positions and things like that. But at first, they're not going to do a heap of damage. But they look intimidating. So it encourages the casters to start using AoE spells, which typically are higher level spells, especially when you're playing in the kind of low to middling levels, tier 1, tier 2 sort of play, and it can get rid of a lot of resources really quickly. Now, stage 2 of this operation was reinforcements arrive, the Mast in danger. This is where even more ships arrive and where the real kind of enemy combatants of this combat really start to hit the ship. So right at the back of the ship, I had a squad of ogres in pirate garb kind of climb up onto the back of the ship where the players are. These are the big physical threats to the players, but I had one of them who's carrying like a battering ram immediately go for the mast and start striking at the mast to bring it down. And I placed a timer down on the mast to say, this mast will break in 3 turns. And then at the front of the ship, I had a different boat of enemies arrive, including a wizard and some bodyguard. And that wizard cast Fireball in the middle of the ship, setting the middle mast on fire. I put a token down on that middle mast saying this mast will burn and collapse in 3 turns. And now we've gone from a simple combat where the players just need to keep themselves alive and kill the enemy to we now have 2 objectives. There are 2 masts that are going to be destroyed. We need to stop the ogre, and we need to put out the fire on the midship mast. During this section of the combat, the players fought against the ogres. One of them got thrown overboard. The party kobold rogue got thrown overboard. So we had that element of play where we've got a player in the water having to deal with waterborne combat, climbing back up, all of those elements. And we've also got the fact that there are 2 masts in danger. The players split up, which is always a great thing, especially when the players have got all their resources. If you can split them up, you can overwhelm them and start draining those resources much, much quicker. So the players split up, the fighter and the monk headed up the ship towards the mast on fire, but they didn't have any way to deal with it. The party cleric didn't have create water. None of them thought about grabbing buckets and trying to like throw buckets of water on the mast or anything. They kind of arrived at the mast on fire and were like,
Don't know what we're going to do now. I guess we'll go after the wizard.
And fought their way through that difficult terrain in the midship, past some of the bodyguards towards the wizard. And at the back of the ship, we had the wizard and the cleric dealing with the ogres, and the rogue in the water trying to get back onto the ship. And then for the third stage of this combat, don't ignore the wizard, anchors away. The party monk was at the level where they had Step of the Wind and had the ability to move great distances at great speed. And I'd accounted for this. That's why I'd put enemies right at the front of the ship when the players started right at the back, because I knew the monk had the ability to cross that distance incredibly quickly. The wizard, squishy caster, a monk would almost certainly kick the shit out of him. I thought it would be fine. The monk was too frightened to charge in. They ran into some of the combat, took a bunch of damage from some of the mobs, and that made them really cagey. And instead of charging towards the wizard and pressing on kind of the logical choice for combatant, they kind of stayed in the midship, darting in and out of combat with the mooks in the midship. That changed everything about the combat. It gave the wizard an uninterrupted period of time to do whatever he wanted in the front of the ship. In this case, it was to start kind of disabling the anchors, to drop the anchors of the ship and to bring it to a stop. And it was at this point the players saw the approaching stronghold of the pirates, this vast floating fortress made up of hundreds of ships all cobbled together, with a great megalodon maw at the front of it, which would come and swallow their ship if it stopped. So now we have multiple elements of tension. We've got 2 masts burning, which are given as a time element. We've got the wizard going for the anchors, which will stop the ship if he's left uninterrupted. And we've got this looming presence of the pirate fortress. The players went from feeling like they had this well in hand in the first couple of turns, because it was a bunch of really low level minions that they were absolutely cleaving through, to feeling like everything was falling apart because there was so many plates spinning in the air, and it really ratcheted up the tension. The cleric and the wizard were able to defeat the ogres and start working their way up the ship. They'd saved the rear mast, but no one really did anything with the mid-mast, and they let the time expire. The mast burned and collapsed, which reduced their speed and meant that the pirate ship was getting ever closer. Not close enough to catch them yet, but if that wizard was able to drop those anchors, it would be all over. So the monk at this point could have gone Step of the Wind all the way to the front, but again was too cagey, too hesitant to go up there, which meant the wizard had another uninterrupted turn to disable one of the anchor housings, bring an anchor down, and start to slow the ship. This is when things started getting really bad for the players, and everyone's focus became get to the front of the ship and stop that wizard. The fighter was the first to arrive. They kicked the crap out of the wizard, almost killed him. He managed to jump over the ship and abandon ship at the last moment. But then the fighter was able to go to the anchor and basically destroy it, to disconnect it from the ship and allow them to start picking up speed again, which was the thing that saved them and allowed them to stay out of the clutches of that pirate fortress. Finishing off the last couple of mooks, they needed to figure out what are we going to do about this pirate fortress. So they took one of the skiffs that the pirate groups had arrived on, loaded it up with all of the gunpowder and pitch from the ship that they were on, and then set minor illusions on it to look like a big old pile of gold, and just set that free behind them so that the pirate stronghold would gobble it up through the mouth of this giant megalodon, and then it could detonate inside and kind of disable that ship, which allowed them to get away. But because they hadn't focused on the midship mast, the ship was absolutely ravaged, meaning they were crawling away, and they had to stop at a nearby port, delay their arrival for their ultimate destination, and take a period of downtime in a new city while their ship got repaired. Overall, it was a really, really exciting combat because there was a bunch of different elements going on with it, and every time the players got settled and thought they knew what the lay of the land was, and they thought they knew what the situation was, a new element was introduced, new enemies arrived, new tensions were introduced, that meant they had to change their approach. And that's my biggest suggestion to you if you're running encounters for players that are at kind of full capacity and you don't want to run multiple encounters in the day, is introduce lots of little side objectives, lots of little elements throughout the encounter that they have to go and deal with, because it helps keep that tension on even when they're not necessarily taking a lot of damage, because there's more than one way to lose a combat, right? They don't have to go down to 0 hit points. If their ship had been disabled, they'd have been swallowed by the pirate vessel, and then presumably hundreds of pirates would have attacked them, and then they probably would have gone down to 0 hit points. So you don't need to necessarily threaten their hit points in the moment then and there. You just want to give them other levers to pull on the tension. Hope you found that useful, and it gives you some tips on how to ratchet up the tension in your combats. Don't forget to check out all of the other videos in the Kraken Week playlist. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. And if you want to keep watching, you can check out this video right here where I talk about 5 recent one-shots that I've run and why they were awesome. But until next time, happy gaming.